started.
Okay, Madam Chair, we're live.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Welcome. This is committee number 6, Travel, Recreation, Wildlife, and Cultural Resources. We'll call this meeting to order. Carol, if you'd please call the roll.
Representative Banks.
Here.
Representative Harrelson.
Excused.
Representative Jennings.
Excused.
Representative Knapp.
Here.
Vice Chair Newsom.
Here.
Representative Sweeney.
Here.
Representative Williams.
Here.
Representative Winter.
Here.
Madam Chair Flitner.
Present. All right, committee, our first bill before us today is Senate File 7, Wyoming Gaming Commission, Scrivener error. And I think we'll just knock this out real quick. We're all familiar with this bill. Prior to 2020, skill-based amusement games were operating in Wyoming without regulation. In 2020, we passed House Bill 171, which provided a regulatory framework to authorize the games for a 1-year period. House Bill 171 converted the Parimutuel Commission to the Gaming Commission and required that skill game operators obtain a license in order to operate in the state of Wyoming. It also added 2 new members to the commission, a law enforcement representative and a tribal member. It also allowed the Gaming Commission to hire law enforcement to act as peace officers and to enforce all relevant laws. House Bill 171 was passed as a session law and was not codified in the Green Books as it was intended to be. So the legislature crafted Senate File 56 in 2021 to codify the regulatory framework, and in doing so, repealed House Bill 171. Unfortunately, the bill should have repealed only Section 1 of House Bill 171. Instead, it repealed Senate File 56 and repealed the entire bill. So this bill was drafted to fix that problem and correct that error. And so unless we have questions, committee, what would you like to do about? Bill has been moved by Newsom, seconded by Sweeney. Questions, committee, or discussion? All right, Carol, would you please? Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Obviously, I'm glad to see this before us because this is cleaning up an issue that's been out there. And so I'm glad we get to move forward and correct our errors from last year and look forward to being able to put this back on kind of some sure footing.
Okay, thank you. Question having been called, please call the roll.
Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Harrelson.
Aye.
Representative Jennings.
Excused.
Representative Jennings left an aye vote, an absentee vote.
Okay.
Representative Knapp.
Aye.
Vice Chair Newsom.
Aye.
Representative Sweeney.
Aye.
Representative Williams. Representative Winter.
Aye.
Madam Chair Flitner.
Aye.
Madam Chair, there are 9 ayes and 0 noes. Do
Thank you.
pass.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Carol. Nobody's leaving the room. I thought you were all here for that bill. All right, moving right along. Senate File 61. So, Director, would you mind joining us? And if there's anybody else with the executive branch who is joining you, they're please welcome to come to the table. And is Senator Perkins, will he be joining us?
Madam Chair, I assumed so, but I don't see him in the room.
Okay, I sent him an email, but I didn't get a reply. So I bet he's got a conflict with appropriations. So would you mind walking us through this?
Absolutely, Madam Chair. And I do know that what I thought I'd do is talk about what this bill does, provide a little bit of background with how this statute's been used in Wyoming over the past 4 years since this law was enacted. And then I do know that there's public testimony here specifically from the only bird farm in Wyoming that's been permitted to this point. And they've got quite a bit of background information as well. So There'll be different venues to bring you different information for your consideration here today. So essentially, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Brian Nesbitt, Director of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. The purpose of this bill today is to simply remove a sunset that was enacted with the original legislation here 4 years ago, when the Wyoming legislature provided authority for the commission and the department to permit the captive breeding, egg collection, and a captive breeding program for the greater sage grouse. Since the bill was enacted here 4 years ago, the commission then followed through with developing regulations, and I would say some very tight regulations that very closely regulated any permittee that should come before the department. There was, when this bill was passed, there was one proponent that was already interested. That's, I think, what gave rise to the legislation. There was a proponent who you'll hear from today who was interested in doing, experimenting with this potential tool to captively breed sage grouse for potential supplementing existing populations. In 2018, there was a certification issued to the bird farm that you'll hear from here today, but they ended up not pursuing an application to go and collect eggs that year or the next year. The following year, they did submit an application, were permitted, received all of the necessary regulatory requirements to go and collect eggs, and they were unsuccessful. This was the first attempt that they had made. They used techniques mainly using pointing dogs to try to find eggs that way to collect them, and were unsuccessful. The following year, 2021, they changed their techniques using radio telemetry and were able to collect eggs from the wild and then hatch those eggs and raise those birds. Today, there are, I believe, around 50 birds that have survived through this first initial effort. And to date, that's no birds have been released into the wild. And this is really just the first year. These birds that are held at the bird farm now are this past year's hatchlings. And with that, Madam Chair, I'd be glad to answer any questions. That's pretty much it. That's a good summary, I think, of where we've been.
Okay, thank you. I believe Senator Perkins has joined us. Would you mind coming to the table? Thank you. It's good to see you. It's always good to see you.
We sat next to each other in the plane, so we gave something to each other. It's probably Saturday. We have already half done. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. The good director has sort of got us up to speed at this point. Would you care to interject?
Sure, and I didn't hear what the good director said. If you want me, I'll just run through a couple things I want to talk about the bill on, and that I think are important. First of all, I think it's important to know that this is by a foundation, that this is not intended to, and has never been expressed to be a for-profit enterprise. This is a foundation has two purposes of both learning more about the sage grouse as well as providing another or an additional tool in the quiver in our fight against listing. And we all know that listing is incredibly, fortunately and unfortunately, because it's a wonderful bird and it's an important part of Wyoming and our heritage. But the unfortunate part of that is that the majority of the listing requirement rests heavily on Wyoming, because we have the largest. And I may be wrong, and the director's more than welcome to correct me, but we have the largest population of these birds, and so what we do here matters. And so, in doing this, this is there's two consulting biologists that are on staff. And one they've hired to be a consultant. The other one is actually one helps runs the this is done at the game bird farm up outside of in Bighorn Basin up by Powell. They've consulted with those folks and they're learning a lot about it. But they have two of those folks. And they've raised over 75,000 game birds at that facility before and then they've taken underdone this. And I think the director probably told you that there was very strict regulations they've got. I think the pens for the Sage grouse are at least a quarter mile away from the other birds because they don't want transmission of disease. They've had to do a number of things that were very stringent requirements to get through and get their permit under the Game and Fish. And I think that what I believe that the good director said when we were talking about this in the Senate committee was that they've had stringent guidelines on them. They watch them, and every year they have to come back and prove this to prove where they're at and what they're doing and how they're going about this to the Game and Fish folks. And there's also, I think it's important to know that in this is research effort, they're also, they're consulting with Calgary Zoo, and there's also a lesser sage grouse activity going on I believe in New Mexico. And they're also consulting with these people, trying to exchange information about how you help this bird move forward. So, and just a couple of numbers for you. Of the 250 that they were authorized by statute to gather, they gathered 133 of those eggs. 2 of those were broken in the field. There were 19 that were infertile. They hatched 122. 16 chicks were lost because of egg starvation or deformity. And those were all under 7 days old. There's been some other losses as they learned about how to deal with these birds in the flight pens and stuff. But they've done things to correct those. And so there are still 51 sage grouse at the Powell Bird Farm as of now, and the current and plans that they're all be used as breeding stock. So they anticipate that this was a one-time collection of eggs, and there will not be another collection of eggs. I think in doing that, I think that it's important to know that the permit process is also open to the public and can be reviewed by the public, and that there are no future plans to gather more eggs other than the fact that if they come and they decide they need more genetic diversity, that they may want to have a few more eggs from other places to introduce some genetic diversity. But other than that, they do not intend to gather more eggs. And that's the only reason that they prefer that they would hope that the provision to allow them to gather eggs would be restricted. They have reached out to the University of the University of Wyoming. That was how did I get the University of Utah to the University of Wyoming?
Did that.
Those Utes. Anyway, the University of Wyoming and also Northwestern Community College to see if they get them interested. So far, neither of those institutions have expressed interest in the research, which befuddles me a little bit, but nevertheless, that's what the report is. So with that, I think that it's important that this removes a sunset date. Quite frankly, in talking to the folks doing this, if somebody wanted to reduce the egg collection to 125 from 250, that would not seem to interfere with what they perceive may be necessary at some point if they want to do genetic diversity. But they would be okay with that. They're more than willing to work with this and be reasonable. But this is really important, and the next several years will be very, very important. They have done what a lot of folks didn't know if you could do, and they've actually hatched these eggs. They've raised them. They now have raised them in captivity, and now comes in that part about how do they do, and how much of what these birds learn is instinctive, and how much of it's taught behavior. And so they're entering into that over the next couple of years. It'll be very important to figure that out. But there's some thoughts about how you can go about and do that. And there's consistent interplay between folks that are trying to figure this out, not just in Wyoming, but these folks. And the last thing I would say is that there's not been $1 of government money spent in doing this. This has been a private effort, because from someone who believes in this, that it's not to replace, it's not to substitute for habitat, but it's to simply have another arrow in the quiver to fight listing, which is probably somewhere between $5 and $6 billion a year to the Wyoming economy if this bird is listed. And so with that, I think they're trying to be transparent. They're trying to provide for knowledge transfer. That's why they've contacted the university and the community colleges. I hope that somebody over there will get a little bit more interest in this, because it is a project and a bird that is vital to Wyoming and how we move forward. So with that, Madam Chairman, I'll stand for questions, or we'll let somebody else go.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Committee questions for Chairman Perkins? Yes, Representative Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I think actually my question might be for the director. But maybe either of you, are there other examples where we do allow this collection of sort of public assets for this kind of private venture?
Director,
Madam Chair, Representative Banks, no.
committee, further questions? Vice Chairman Newsom, and then Representative Sweeney, and then Haroldson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Do we know the survival rate in the wild of the sage grouse?
Director.
Madam Chair, Representative Newsom. No, I think you'll hear this too from the proponents. The Calgary Zoo has done some work where they've raised some birds in captivity. I don't know the specifics of their research when they've gone and released birds to the wild. What I do know is they've indicated that that's where their next challenge is that they haven't had great survival when they've released them. But I can't give you like a specific number. There has been some other research that's been done, but there's a pretty big data gap in knowing what happens when these birds are raised in captivity. Not just only eggs collected and then raised, but also then bred in captivity and released to the wild. That survival rate there's not a lot of information or research that provides a good any good information there.
Follow up.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was talking about birds in the wild. So do we know the survival rate based on number of eggs laid and live birds in the wild?
Yeah. Madam Chair, Representative Newsom, that is variable year to year. They're very dependent on a few very critical factors, but I would boil it all down to spring moisture is extremely important to how successful they are with reproduction each year. They're in a low water year, you can see like towards the end of the summer after their first few months of life, the number of chicks per hen being as low as 1.2, 1.3 chicks per hen in a bad year. And sometimes, up to in really good years and specific areas, you can see up to like 2, even 3 chicks per hen in localized areas, just depending on the moisture regime for that year. They depend really heavily on cover, herbaceous cover, and that's both to protect them from predation, but it's also critical for these birds in their first year of life. They depend almost entirely on protein fat diet, so insects, and the more herbaceous cover you have, the more insect production there is, and the better those young birds do. Population wise though, these populations in Wyoming, for as long as we've been collecting information, they are very cyclical and follow a similar to cottontail rabbits. They follow an up and down cycle. We're in the bottom of the trough right now, and kind of in that normal cycle.
Thank you. Representative Sweeney.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman. So, Senator Perkins, in your mind on this, do you, in putting this together, did you contemplate just extending the sunset date versus the elimination of the sunset date?
Chairman Perkins.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, Representative Sweeney, the contemplation that I had was we removed the sunset. And the reason being that we need to know more about this bird. And this is a tremendous opportunity to find more about this bird. As the director said, there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that we're learning. And for example, talking with someone who knows a lot about sage-grouse this last weekend, they talked about, about certain properties of the chicks are very instinctual, but there's other things, particularly avoiding predation or things like that, are more likely to be taught by mothers. And so you're looking at, as you go forward, and it's not necessarily just releasing to the wild, but you can graft them onto collared hens. And hens can do that. And so there may be ways to teach chicks into the wild about to increase the successes. But again, I think the director just told you the issue is there's a knowledge gap. We don't know that much about this bird. It's not being researched like it should. And this private foundation seems to be, at least in the United States, the one that's probably doing the most work on researching sage grouse besides what we've been doing what we've been doing as a state. So you've got you've got it's a little bit different bent, but it's a private area that's doing that. And we'll see how it goes. There's no anticipation you're going to harvest eggs and do this. Whole thing is whether you can rear them in the wild. I mean, you can take them and rear them in captivity and then acclimate them and help them to figure out what they're doing in the wild. And it's going to be successful. And it's not. I mean, if you know, and like I said, the next few years will be very, very important. If those next few years are successful, we may learn a lot, and this may be a great thing to move on. If it's not, I think it will die a natural death. If it can't be done successfully, these folks aren't going to do this forever on their own dime. And so I think that ultimately it will take care of itself one way or another.
Okay, Representative Haroldson. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a follow-up? My apologies.
Yes, Madam Chairman, if I could. So Chairman Perkins, would it bother you immensely if we put back in, say, a sunset date? I'm not sure what that looks like, but I'll just throw a number out for 10 years in the future. Do you think that your intent?
Mr. Chairman.
I mean, it's not my intent, but my intent yields to what the bodies do. I mean, it's majority of the House, majority of the Senate, and then the governor's signature. It's what it takes to be it. So once these bills come out, it's not intent. If I don't support putting a sunset date on it, but if you were, please don't put it an even number of years from now, because it puts it back in a budget session where you have 2/3 vote for entry. So if you do it, please do it with an odd numbered year. So it comes in an odd number of years, so we don't have to you have the time to do it and do it right.
Okay, thank you. Representative Haroldson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Director Nesvik, so the 250 egg count number and that collection, is that collection completely regulated by Game and Fish as far as what area, what years, those things? Because I understand they've already done that over a course of 3 years. But if there were to be the genetic diversification concept, how are they deciding where those eggs are being collected from, and what involvement does your department have with that collection?
Director.
Madam Chair, Representative Haroldson. So yes, we do. We do analysis and select the best places that would work the best to collect those eggs. And then we oversee the collection as well. We go out in the field with the permittee and go through the whole, from start to finish, the whole process with them.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir.
can I add one thought to that
Sure.
question? One of the things that's been very interesting is I just want the committee to understand that there's only been one egg collection ever. And that was the 133 eggs that I referred to earlier. One of the other things that was done, and it was actually from somebody outside these folks, took their suggestion. They'd had several years, they were trying to find these eggs and they weren't very successful at it. They finally collared some hens. So they had radio transmitters, and they then went and followed them to their nests, and that's how they ended up collecting them under the supervision of the Game and Fish. One of the other things that is very interesting is then observed those nests and to see what would happen. And they were very careful about how they collected them. They used gloves and did a number of other things that the biologists and other people knowledgeable about these things had advised them to do. And then they monitored those nests, and significant, I don't know if it's a majority, but a significant number of those hens, I think it was a majority, but I could be wrong about that, but actually returned and laid eggs in the same nest, which was, that in and of itself was valuable information. So I just wanted to add that, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. That's interesting. Further questions all right. Thank you both. I appreciate it. Thanks for stepping up and presenting that to us. Do we have anybody else from the executive branch that wants to provide any testimony? All right, seeing none, we will open this to public testimony. So please come forward.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Jess Johnson with the Wyoming Wildlife Federation. And I brought my colleague Anna up here because she can speak a little more to the science than I can. So I will try to address some of the hunting voice concerns, and she will sort of address some of the science side of that.
My name is Anna Kaufman, Madam Chair. I'm with the Wyoming Wildlife Federation as well. I'm also an avid upland hunter. My bird dog puppy is at training right now, so that I can be here speaking with all of you. So we're very excited to speak with you today.
So we'll try and keep this brief, but 47 years ago in 1975, the Wyoming Wildlife Federation sat in front of a committee a lot like this, and we vehemently supported a bill banning any new game farms for deer and elk, based on the premise that privatization of a public resource went against everything that upholds Wyoming values. I think hunters understood then, as we understand now, that game farms introduce opportunities for disease risks, disturbance of native local populations, and at the very best are poor substitutes for population supplementation. We don't solve our mule deer problem with deer farms. Why would we do this with sage grouse? In fact, I would argue that introducing the idea of deer farms in other states because of chronic wasting disease and everything that has happened since likely put the mule deer a little further towards the population decline than it meant to be.
The reality of pen raising birds and captive breeding programs is that they're effective for increasing hunting opportunity. They're not effective for increasing wild populations. And we do want to make sure that we emphasize that this statute is not written for the existing farm. We have to talk about what the statute actually does. And the statute allows for 4 more licensees. It allows 4 more licensees to collect eggs. It allows 4 more licensees to be taking up game and fish dollars and time. And so we really respect what the current licensee is doing. They have done everything to meet all of the game and fish's benchmarks and have been trying to do this research, and we appreciate that, but we don't want what the statute actually does to be lost in the conversation. In pheasants, survival rates are 4 to 8% over the course of 6 months when pen raised birds are released. It's not good. And when translocated birds from wild populations to a different location are moved, it's over 40%. So as a conservation measure, we already know from other game birds that pen raised birds have abysmal survival rates compared to wild birds. And that's been reflected in the Calgary experiment as well. They released 66 birds in 2018. Only 2 of them survived and only 1 hatched a brood, and they haven't had survival rates improving so far. We have a professor at the University of Alberta that will hopefully be joining us on Zoom. He used to work at the University of Wyoming, and he raised captive sage grouse at the University of Wyoming in the late 80s and early 90s. And so we really hope that he'll be able to get out of his class to speak with you and talk to you about what we've been learning in research experiments since the 90s about this issue.
I think what we're really focusing on is that this bill does allow for 5 farms currently under the game and fish regulation to experiment with sage grouse egg collection. The words in the statute are referencing hatching, rearing, breeding, selling, canned hunts, and release of sage grouse. So like Anna said, I would like to reiterate what we're concerned with is what the statute is saying. This is the other part that concerns us is it also allows for each licensed farm to hold that research and the methods as proprietary information. And this is very, very different from how agencies and universities operate published research. The removal of the sunset altogether allows for these practices to persist in perpetuity, which is where our concern comes from. Egg collections, as we heard, are watched by the department, and we're very thankful for that. But there is very little science on what that disturbance does to these sage grouse. And if we are in a position where we are looking to do everything for the bird, we feel that exposing them to this is actually probably more risky than it is beneficial.
You'll hear a lot about using every tool in the toolbox, but I think that everyone who's built something knows that it's more important to use the right tools than to use every tool. And we know that pen-raised birds don't survive very well. We know that universities have been conducting research about this for a long time. And we also know, or at least it's our understanding, that this farm could continue operating with the birds that they have and continue conducting the good research that they have been doing and hopefully build on that without this statute. The Game and Fish can offer them a special permit under Title 10 to do that. And so our concern with what the statute actually does doesn't extend to whether or not their research and the information gathering that they've been doing would be allowed to continue.
So Wyoming holds 38% of the world's greater sage grouse. What we do here today has repercussions in other states and other countries tomorrow. Sage grouse work in this state spans 3 administrations and is the culmination of work from many, many stakeholders. It has been incredibly successful. Greater sage grouse have a habitat problem in this state. It is not a population problem. And while it takes more time at the table and oftentimes compromised from all involved, habitat work is where we will find long-term wins for this bird. That is the cowboy way. Just putting more birds on the landscape without the habitat health to support them is no different than releasing birds for put and take hunting. We're really asking that we put this bill to bed and let the current licensed farm continue its very good work with its 50 birds that they have left under the permit that can be issued from the department. Please vote no for this.
Thank you. Committee, questions for the Wildlife Federation? Seeing none. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please come forward. Who's next?
Madam Chair and Committee. Good afternoon. My name is Yufna Soldrov. I'd like to first say hello in my own language. Dos Besi Netiana Nanana Yufna Soldrov. I'm a member of the Northern Arapaho tribe. I live on the Wind River Reservation. I'm here today because I work with the Indigenous Land Alliance of Wyoming. Our main goal with Indigenous Land Alliance is to speak through traditional ecological knowledge. And I'm here today to talk about the sage grouse. Many times in the past, my ancestors have talked about how unnatural and unholy it is to experiment with any species, to interrupt a natural environment of any species, and to wreck any species' natural cycles adversely impacts everyone's lives eventually. Sage grouse are important birds to many Native American tribes. The bird is so important to tribes that the bird has its own dance. In my tribe, it has meaning, and that meaning has symbology. With each tribe, respectfully, we all have values, and we all have a shared value with the sage grouse. The issue at hand is not the sage grouse. The issue at hand is the management of the land for the sage grouse. In 2017, when the sage grouse farming was temporarily made legal through the original bill, then government expressed his skepticism and did not sign the bill. The idea of a sunset in the statute was meant to ensure a review was generated so the public debate on this issue could continue. My question is, has there been any generated data to support the continuation of this experiment? And has it been successful and safe for the sage grouse? My request is to please show some clear transparency and accountability for the sage grouse bill. Any private operators who farm under the statute should, at a minimum, be required to operate with open farms under the statute. At a minimum, should be required to proactively report about successes and failures to the public through regular Game and Fish Commission reports, other public discussions or reports. I have not seen any of that data generated. Ultimately, I believe that it would be better for the sage grouse to build to die. The farm could be legally permitted outside the statute, but then the private business of collecting eggs would be ended. Whatever the community decides to do with this bill, I ask for transparency and accountability to the public, and that should be a high priority. I stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Question for the Indigenous Land Alliance Committee? Thank you. Appreciate your testimony.
Madam Chairwoman and committee members, my name is Terry Riley with the North American Grouse Partnership, and I'm their Director of Policy. Just to go over, I'm having a handout given to you that we put together on this very specific subject regarding sage grouse in Wyoming particularly. My background is I have a bachelor's of fisheries and wildlife science from Kansas State University, a master's in wildlife science from New Mexico State University, a master's and a PhD in zoology from Ohio State University. the Ohio State University. I've worked as the Director of Conservation for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I've been Director of Conservation for the Wildlife Management Institute in Washington, D.C. I worked for the Forest Service for 8 years as a wildlife biologist, and I was the pheasant biologist in Iowa for the state of Iowa for quite a long time. So I've got a background in a lot of different things, including a lot dealing with policy and how legislation works and how it affects wildlife, including endangered species. I'll be brief today on what I want to say is because I think there's a lot of information that will be given to you. Basically, the privatization of a public resource is just not what we support, the North American Grouse Partnership, primarily because this is a public trust resource, as is the greater sage grouse here in Wyoming. And obviously, the greater sage grouse is extremely important in Wyoming because it obviously has a tremendous impact on the overall population worldwide. And I think it's important to realize that if we try to commercialize or do research on this species or any species that is under threat, we run the risk that we are not going to be able to collect science and get it published in scientific journals so people can use it. If we want to move forward with science, and this is science, it really is. If we want to do it right, we have to have somebody like a zoo or a state wildlife agency or the cooperative fish and wildlife research units that are at various universities to actually do this and get the information published. Anytime we have a private entity actually collecting data and using it for their own purposes, but not necessarily putting it into scientific journals, it doesn't help move science forward. And as we've heard already, if we don't have science on how to rear these birds in captivity, once they get listed as an endangered species or a threatened species, we're going to be in a world of hurt if we don't have some good information that's available to the state fish and wildlife agencies to help solve the problem, because this is a trust resource that they have for the people of Wyoming. And it is extremely important to realize that this public resource is only entrusted to the states. And if it slips into an endangered status or a threatened status, it becomes like a trust resource for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and none of us in this room want that to happen. And our goal is for the North American Grouse Partnership is to make sure we have as few grouse species as possible get into that situation where they might be listed as a threatened or endangered species and their population is endangered. Obviously, we talked about a cyclic population. The problem is the cycle is going like this. So we had a very large population of sage grouse at one point in time, and it does go up and down from year to year, as was mentioned earlier. But that cycle is just continuing to go towards zero. And if we don't do something, we're going to have a problem with that. The main threat to sage grouse, as you've probably already heard, is habitat loss and habitat degradation. And we know how to do that, but most of it is on private land or on public land where we have little control about what's happening. Oil and gas development is a higher priority in many areas than is saving the sage grouse. Ranching in Wyoming is extremely important, but most ranchers really don't have the science necessary to provide good habitat for sage grouse. So if we don't have the habitat, it isn't going to do us any good to stock the birds. And as being pheasant biologist in Iowa for quite a long time, I've seen many entities try to rear pheasants in captivity, turn them loose, and actually reproduce in the wild. That has been after over 120 years in captivity, and since they've been imported from Asia, we have not been able to do it with pheasants. And pheasants are a lot more resilient than sage grouse. If we can't do it with pheasants, and we've had years of work at trying to do this with private and public entities, it's just not going to happen with sage grouse. There's a lot of other problems that we have with sage grouse. Pheasants will nest in road ditches successfully. Sage grouse will not. And that's a real significant problem that we have. One of the 5 factors that the Fish and Wildlife Service has to used to make a decision whether to list a bird or not is whether there's overutilization for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes. When the Fish and Wildlife Service evaluates the greater sage grouse the next time they're petitioned to list this species, this is going to be one of the things that's going to be brought up to them, the commercialization of a public trust resource. And that could lead them right down the path to another notch in the reasoning why they would list the species. We support the North American Grouse Partnership supports responsible, professional, scientific, and transparent approaches to learning about captive propagation. As I said, if we can learn about it, figure out how to do it so that more than 2% survive in the wild and reproduce. That's going to be the key. If we can't do that with pheasants, we're never going to be able to do it with sage grouse unless we really, really work at trying to figure out the science. There are entities that can do this, and University of Wyoming is a prime example. They've done a lot of research on sage grouse. And I think that's where this kind of should lead to. And that's all. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Committee, questions for the North American Grouse Partnership? Okay, Vice Chairman Newsom.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Do we know how many wild sage grouse there are now? That might be a question more for the director, but I wonder if you have that answer.
The population has fluctuated a lot, as you've probably heard. And if you're talking about birds that survive the winter, and that's probably before reproduction. As was mentioned, we have several 100,000 here in Wyoming, and I think 9 to 11 states, depending on how you talk to them, and some in Canada, probably less than a couple of million total. And it's really hard to count them. So, they're scattered everywhere, and counting them is extremely difficult. So I'm sorry, I didn't address the Madam Chairwoman and Vice Chair Newsom, sorry, and the rest of the committee.
Thank you. Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So if I'm understanding properly, this would be take it out of a private entity that's paying all the bills, with the exception of the regulatory body. In the fiscal note, it says about $17,000, but take it and put it with the University of Wyoming. That would cost the state probably, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars for that portion. And my thing with this is, if we're looking at, depending on the science, I would hope that you'd be in agreement, any effort to try to get to the science beyond habitat, but to get more birds to hatch and to better understand how the inner workings, I just think is more relative to the conversation on continuing on. But I'm sure you'll disagree, but on the other hand, is the goal to get down to 0 birds when somebody's trying to help in the science? Is that the goal, to eliminate the birds?
Mr. Riley.
Madam Chair, committee members, Representative Sweeney, I think the goal is to keep them off the endangered species list. That is ultimately what we would like to have. And we do that with all grouse, all 12 North American grouse species. And some of them are getting a lot closer than the sage grouse is. And we are working very diligently to try to deal with that. Lesser prairie chickens, as mentioned by Chairman Sweeney earlier, they're working desperately to figure out how to scientifically do this. But if you don't do it in a systematic way, you waste a lot of energy and time and money, because science is done one bit at a time, and it builds on itself. If you have fractured processes, it costs a lot more money, it takes a lot more time. And if those data are not shared with other entities, state fish and wildlife agencies primarily, then you run the risk that you're going to spend a lot of money and time and it's not going to be of great value. So as we approach the problem of potential listing under the Endangered Species Act and federal control that results from that, it's going to be very, very difficult if we don't have techniques that are well developed. And I don't contest the idea that every little bit helps, but in a situation where the sage grouse has been petitioned to list already a couple of times, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has, the greater sage grouse, has chosen not to list sorta, and it will probably be petitioned again because we are still declining in the population overall. And so it's a matter of, timing that is critical here, and how do you share data and make sure that the processes, if they are capable, because we still have a situation basically where you capture birds or take eggs in the wild, raise them in captivity, and then you supposedly are going to release these birds at some point in time. And, as we mentioned earlier, the survival rate on sage grouse chicks under natural conditions is only about 50% after about 6 months, and maybe even less, maybe even 3 months. If you have a situation where you only have 2% surviving, and then a very small fraction of those actually successfully reproducing in the wild, because they have no skill at avoiding predators. There's no instinct that's going to teach you how to avoid a hawk from getting you, and there's no instinct on how this 1 ounce chick that can't fly for 3 weeks is going to survive on the ground by itself while running around with a hen, but the hen does not have the capacity to protect it from other things. Can't fight off a coyote or even a chipmunk for that matter. But it's extremely important to realize that these little guys, 1 ounce, they have to run around for 3 weeks before they can fly. So they're terribly vulnerable. That's why they don't survive in the wild. And if you don't have a hen that really knows how to teach them how to avoid predators, and they don't get that in a pen rear situation. I've probably taken up more time than you like, but I'd be happy to answer more questions, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. We appreciate it, committee. Yes, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You talked a lot about science and how much the government needs to be involved, or the university, and this goal to keep these birds off the endangered species list. Is this private bird farm? Is that not a shared goal that they have?
It's
Mr. Riley.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Madam Chairman, I'm sorry. And Representative Williams, the goal, again, is to keep them off the endangered species list. What we want to do is keep the control of this species with the Wyoming Game and Fish, because it is their trust resource for the public resource. And this, as I said, science is an incremental thing. Nobody can discover everything in one study. It has to be slow and steady. And unfortunately, if you don't do it in a way that the Wyoming Game and Fish is very much involved and not dictated to on how they will be involved, I think it's really important to realize that you will be unsuccessful at keeping it off the endangered species list. Maybe I didn't answer your question appropriately, but.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for coming. Who's next?
Madam Chair, representatives of the committee. I just want to briefly talk a little bit about my background. My name is Chris Carroll. I actually grew up in Cody, Wyoming. I saw my first sage grouse when I was 17 years old on a field trip, and I've been interested in this bird ever since. I have been doing research on sage grouse for almost 15 years now.
Mr. Carroll, who do you represent?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm here as a private citizen, but I'm also on the Northeast Sage Grouse Working Group.
Okay.
And I'm currently a postdoc researcher studying sage grouse in Northeast Wyoming. And so some of this has already been spoken to, but you know, on face value, I could see how this bill looks good. But when you actually spend a lot of time with sage grouse in the field, you can kind of see all the potential problems with this. So a lot of my work has to do with reproductive attempts of sage grouse. So we put transmitters on sage grouse, we follow them through the environment and see how well they're doing. And there's a lot of steps that go into a successful reproductive attempt. First, the female has to find the right shrub and have a nest. And then she hopefully will find a shrub that is in a good place to avoid predators. And then she has to hatch that nest. And then, as what was spoken to before, she has these tiny little chicks that she has to lead to this environment while all these predators, including different hawks and coyotes and other mammals, are trying to eat these chicks. And we observe this while we're tracking them. And what you do learn is that they are definitely learning from their mother as they go through this environment. And so that learned behavior is absolutely critical. And so when I hear these estimates of, 1% success from the Calgary Zoo, that I know I've put all kinds of resources in this, I've talked to some of the people who are working on this, it actually doesn't surprise me, because when you release an individual to the wild that has zero experience of sagebrush habitat, zero experience with these predators, you're just basically putting them out there to feed predators. Like, they're not going to know what to do and how to get away from things. They're not going to know where to take their chicks to survive and reproduce. And so, like some of the Calgary research, as I understand it, out of 66 birds, one actually successfully reproduced. So if we look at the 50 that were raised and in captivity right now in Wyoming, that might be one bird. That's the estimate. One, conservative, actually, that's more of a liberal estimate. One bird might actually reproduce in the wild. So it seems like a whole lot of effort for very little return. And to me, after studying sage grouse for such a long time, feels like it's kind of a distraction from the things we need to be doing, like focusing on the Wyoming Core Area Initiative, which has been a total success story, and focusing on quality habitat and returning areas to quality habitat. The second point I wanted to make is that the impacts, so if we license 4 more places to do this, the impacts far outweigh, in my opinion, the actual benefits. Basically, what this involves, because I've done a lot of this work, is you're catching birds, you're catching female sage grouse on leks in the spring using nets and spotlights. So there is some impact there. We do it for research. We learn a lot from the birds. They're catching them, and then they're just basically using that bird to find the nest. And then when they get to the nest, they're taking eggs. In our experience, if you actually mess with a nest and early on, and some of our research, we saw that if you actually go too close to the nest, the female may abandon, and about half the time they don't come back. So that's a lost nest. And unfortunately, I haven't seen any information from this work because it's not really available. I haven't been able to find it, but I assume that at least half of the birds that they were actually going to their nests and taking eggs abandon those nests. And so that's a large impact in itself. And that's a lot of nests. If you have a nest that has 7 eggs, you're in 130, or I'm not sure the exact number, all of these eggs, that's a lot of nests that you're impacting. And then if you times that times 4 more licensees who are doing this work, I feel like there's way more detriment than benefit to the sage grouse. I guess I think that was all that I really wanted to bring up. My main points were that, I understand I thought of this, but the impact is way greater than the potential benefit. The odds of these females actually surviving in the wild are extremely low. And then the odds of them actually being able to raise chicks, even lower, because they have nobody to learn from. They know nothing about this environment. They're 100% dependent on sagebrush cover, and they need to know how to navigate this area. And just a little example, and then I'll be done. Recently, last summer, I was out tracking one of our females with chicks, and I keep my distance, and I was watching with binoculars, but a golden eagle flew by, and she chirped little at her chicks, and then she ducked, and immediately all her chicks ducked. They're learning how to avoid predators. And if you just have a captive release bird that you just put out in the environment, they're not going to understand any of that behavior. And I think the survival rate is going to be extremely low.
Thank you. Committee questions for Mr. Carroll? Thank you, sir. Appreciate your testimony. Who's next? Come on down.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
My name's Bruce Lawson. I'm a lifelong resident of Casper, Wyoming, and I'm here today to hopefully convince this committee to kill Senate File 61 for
Mr.
two
Watson,
reasons.
do you represent an organization or are you here as a private citizen?
I do not. I'm here as, I'm sorry, I'm here as a
No problem.
public citizen, a citizen. Again, you know, my intent is to convince this committee to kill Senate File 61 for two reasons. One, to protect the health and welfare of our existing native wild sage-grouse populations, and also to end the unprecedented move that the statute has created in creating public ownership of wildlife. I think I probably might bring a little different perspective to the committee in terms of my background. I'm not a wildlife biologist. I have a degree in range management from the University of Wyoming that I earned in 1979. My interest in sage grouse actually started in 1964 when I was 8 years old, and with the help of my father and a lever action 410 shotgun, I collected my very first field specimen of sage grouse, and since then I've collected additional field specimens every year since then. Fast forward to June of 2000, I was appointed by the director of the Game and Fish Department at that time to serve on one of the first game and fish working groups that was developed. And that working group was charged with developing the original statewide sage grouse a statewide sage grouse management plan. And that my assignment on that committee lasted 3 years. We finally finalized that plan in June of 2003. And I'm proud to say that I was able to work closely with Bob Budd. He was a member of that committee, and I think that's the first time I met Bob, and it was a real pleasure to work with Mr. Budd. For over 10 years, I've been a member of the Bates Hole Shirley Basin Local Sage Grouse Working Group. And additionally, the other, I think, unique perspective I bring to the table in terms of sage grouse conservation efforts in Wyoming. For 35 years, I was the mine development and reclamation manager in Casper, Wyoming for Black Hills Bentonite Company. So I was charged with permitting and developing bentonite mining operations throughout Wyoming. And I think, well, I know our company was the only surface mining company of any mineral that was actually conducting active surface mining activities in sage grouse core areas. So I have a real appreciation for the difficulties that the mineral industry faces in light of the regulations surrounding sage grouse, particularly development core areas. You know, you've heard from a lot of other people today, some of the same points I was going to make on why I'm opposed to the extension of the statute and letting it sunset, primarily from the threats of potential diseases that may arise from farming sage grouse. I also want to add that Director Nesvik appointed me a couple of years ago to serve on the Game and Fish's chronic wasting disease working group. And I served on that for about a year. And we finally completed the chronic wasting disease plan for game and fish to follow. And I just, from what I've learned in my activities with the chronic wasting disease working group, I just, as careful as the proponents or operators of a licensed sage grouse captive breeding facility might be, I think that inevitably they're going to release birds that have some disease and transfer that to wild native populations. And it's just not worth the risk. The other point I want to make is one of the other group people that testified brought up the fact that in 1975, there was legislation that was passed preventing the private ownership of wildlife in Wyoming. And since that time, that's held true. This is the first time ever in the history of Wyoming and the Game and Fish Department that anybody has been allowed to privately own a public wildlife resource. Some of you may have known my late brother, Jay Lawson. He was a game warden for 33 years and he was the wildlife division chief for 20 years. And early on after his appointment as wildlife division chief, the department was faced with a lawsuit from a wealthy individual. I think he was the heir to the Campbell Soup fortune. A guy named John Dorrance had a ranch at Devil's Tower, and he had sued the state of Wyoming and the Game and Fish in an attempt to privatize wildlife and bring in exotic species. And I think, as I recall, he wanted ownership of deer and elk as well. But fortunately, with a lot of hard work from my brother and the department and their attorneys, they prevailed in making sure that didn't happen. So this just sets a terrible precedence, I think, in terms of private ownership of wildlife. And if we let this continue, what's next? Sage grouse now, what's the next species we're going to allow private ownership of? So
Thank you, Mr. Lawson.
Thank you for your time.
Questions for Mr. Lawson? Thank you, sir. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Please calm down. We're running a little short of time. So how many more people in the audience want to testify? Oh, goodness. Well, we've already opened the can. So what we'll probably end up having to do is we'll probably have to extend this to Thursday committee. But let's continue with testimony. So please come down. Please bear in mind the number of folks in the room who are wanting to testify. And I also have 3 people online, but we won't get to them today. So please come on down. And if you could, please keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Eustace Scott. My nickname is Stacy, and most people know me as Stacy Scott. I'm here as a private citizen. I've been active in sage grouse for all of my life. Back in the 50s, I counted sage grouse for the Audubon Society in our Christmas bird count in Casper. I'm a retired rancher, so I've been active in sage grouse on our place in Bates Hole. And have been active. I was on the committee to do conservation for sage grouse. The statewide, I'm chairman of the local working group in Bates Hole. And I'm opposed to this bill because it's bad for the state to have ownership, private ownership of grouse, and it's bad for the grouse. I've been told raising grouse from eggs is easy. Anybody could do it. All they could do is learn a little bit. That's not hard. What's hard is getting the bird out there that's never been educated. And even if you had thousands of birds and you put a bunch out there, your chances of disease are great, and you just don't do any good. We can do more with working on our habitat, trying to figure out what it does take to make good habitat. than do anything else. But so I'm opposed, but that's to the bill, especially the egg collection.
Okay. Committee questions for Mr. Scott? Thank you, sir, for coming to Cheyenne. Appreciate it.
Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Tom Christensen. I represent myself today. I live in Green River and my family has maintained continuous residence in Wyoming since 1885. I'm retired from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department where I spent 33 years, 15 of which as the department's sage grouse program coordinator. I assisted the Game and Fish administration with rulemaking regarding the sage grouse bird farm statute, which was passed in 2017 by the legislature in spite of the scientific, ecological, and practical concerns expressed at the time by sage grouse management professionals and the conservation community at large. These concerns have not diminished. I will try not to repeat what you've already heard. I've got a little bit different take on a couple things. Diseases pose a continual threat to captive birds and to wild populations should disease escape the confines of bird farm. One only need consider the fact that in 2011 and 2012, the Game and Fish Department had to destroy thousands of pheasants and pheasant eggs as a result of disease outbreaks. And just last year, another 6,000 birds died from salmonella at the Sheridan Bird Farm. This is not a criticism of the Game and Fish. With diseases in birds, it's not a matter of if, it's when. Nationally, the US is currently experiencing an outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza in both domestic poultry facilities and in wild birds. The supporters of the sage grouse farming experiment cite the potential conservation benefit of the practice being able to replenish depleted wild populations with farm birds. This well-meaning rationale, unfortunately, doesn't stand up to ecological realities and checkbook mathematics. As you've heard, birds that are hatched and raised in captivity rarely survive in the wild. For that reason, biologists in Northwest Colorado have previously experimented with hatching eggs in captivity, then adopting the young chicks to wild broods at an early age. If a hen adopts them, they at least have the advantage of an education in the wild, but the survival of these chicks is low, even when they are adopted into wild broods. And just the process of introducing those chicks to the adult hens and their wild chicks increases the risk of predation. Because of the high mortality associated with releasing captive birds, the number of captive birds required to raise the number of released chicks that might live long enough to reproduce and make a measurable difference in the population is prohibitively large. And here I'd like to quickly address the question that Representative Williams brought up regarding public versus private research. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with private research. It's not a public versus private thing at all. It's the qualifications of the research. You just have to have people that are bona fide researchers, not just biologists. I would not consider myself qualified to do the research that would be required for this. It takes true researchers like Chris Carroll back here or Dr. Riley. That is not a manager or a technician's or even a biologist's role. But they can be private. There's no question that they don't have to be university or government researchers to do that. And finally, we cannot escape the fact that releases of bird farm grouse will not have any chance for success unless and until the environmental conditions that caused the sage grouse decline to begin with have been mitigated, and mitigated in reality on the ground, not on paper. In his 2017 letter to the Game and Fish Director, Governor Mead wrote that the bill has become law without my signature. I have considerable reservations with this new law. As your agency develops rules and regulations, I ask that you ensure that they do not weaken any standard for conservation of the species, and that this time-limited endeavor does not set us down a path that could lead to the listing of the species under the Endangered Species Act. As was Governor Mead's vision of a time-limited experiment, this experiment should end with the existing sunset clause. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you,
Members of the
sir.
committee.
Appreciate it. Committee, questions for Mr. Christensen? Thank you, sir, for your time. Before anyone else steps forward, we've heard a number of folks in opposition to this bill, so I'd like to hear from some people who support this bill. Please come forward. Hello, Mr. True. Mr. President.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Deemer True. I'm president of the Western States Sage Grouse Recovery Foundation. I welcome the opportunity to sort of explain to you our goals. There have been a number of misconceptions concerning our efforts. 5 years ago, the universal testimony was that the bird couldn't be raised in captivity. And we have been able to gather the eggs, transport the eggs, incubate the eggs, hatch the eggs, and raise the sage grouse. But we've learned a lot of practical things in the meantime. Our goal is to preserve the bird and help avoid the bird being listed as endangered on the endangered species list. We are not qualified, nor are we set up to research on the best way to release the bird. We've been reaching out to the University of Wyoming, community colleges, and other foundations, suggesting that that step be over to someone else. Our goal was to show that the bird could be raised in captivity, and we've met that goal. What we haven't finished, we haven't crossed the finish line yet, because we don't know that they'll breed in captivity and lay eggs in captivity. And we'll know that this spring. The sunset is not just for gathering eggs, it's for the entire licensing of the annual permit. And Mr. Smith will speak to that here in a minute. We did find out, because we radio collared these birds, that most, if not all, of the hens where we disturbed the nest and took the eggs went back and laid more eggs. And that's a significant finding. And we still have some of the collars on birds. Now, the precedent for this, one of them is here in Wyoming, the black-footed ferret, which we've been able to reproduce and return to the wild and avoid having it listed on the endangered species list. The California condor, the same thing. They've been able to raise the bird in captivity and is no longer threatened with the endangered species. And the private example is the peregrine falcon. Remember, they put together a foundation out of Buffalo or Sheridan someplace and were able to raise the bird in captivity, and they continue to this day. The Game and Fish knows everything we're doing. We're totally transparent. We want to memorialize it. I, by the way, serve on the sage grouse implementation team as well. This is not in lieu of that effort. This is in addition to it. And in the regs, for example, the birds that might potentially be released must be separated for at least 30 days before they're released, and the Game and Fish has to approve their release. So Mr. Braybeck is owner of the bird farm, and he's got a few remarks.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Could you pull that mic a little closer to yourself? And is there a green light?
Yeah, it's got a green light.
Okay, all right. We just
Okay.
want to make sure we hear you. Thank you. And would you please spell your last name for me?
Brabec.
Thank you, sir.
I'm the majority owner and general manager of Diamond Wings, which is the facility, which is the bird farm up at Powell and is the sage grouse facility. And as they explained earlier, there's a separation between the sage grouse facility, which is a quarter mile from the rest of our game bird farm, so that we meet all the requirements of keeping the birds separated, and that they're to reduce the possibility of disease transmission. I won't be so bold as to say that you'll never have disease transmission, but we are doing everything we possibly can to make sure that there is no disease transmission, including wearing biosecurity when people come to visit, such as visitors, such as game and fish, including myself when I go there. So we are trying to do this as correctly as we can. This is a research project. It is not a commercial project. There is no way that you can make money with this. We are trying to raise this bird in our efforts to keep them off the endangered species list or even be considered. And as we go through our research in this whole process, we have found out several things. Number one, what should have been a 5-year program, we should have been well up. We're only now getting to the point where we can breed and hopefully breed and collect eggs and start the next series of sage grouse. This has taken us 5 years. So that's the reason we have to have this extension. Then our next move after this is we want to go ahead and be able to prove that we can raise these birds. They are raised in an environment that has all kinds of sagebrush, alfalfa, grasses, so that they are in as much of a native environment as we can provide. We want to go ahead and be able to get these birds up to the point where we can raise them, do additional research, such as on West Nile virus, where this, if they develop a vaccine, it can be spread over other broods of sage grouse and potentially prevent them from getting West Nile virus. We have people on staff. We have a registered biologist, and she has, I think, 27 years of experience raising birds. Her husband, Carl Bear, is our chief technician. He has, again, 27 years of raising birds. And also we have another biologist who did most of the egg did all of the egg collection, the collaring. And he is a master's in biology. He has been studying sage grouse, I believe it's for 12 or 13 years. So we have a lot of experience behind us. We have found out a lot of information, and we feel that we're just on the cusp of being able to move forward and really be able to develop a good program here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Mr. Braybeck.
Madam Chair, my name is Mike Smith. I'm with Holland and Hart here in Cheyenne and here representing and working with the Diamond Wings folks. Just real briefly, because I had several questions from some of you and seen some emails or insinuations that if we defeat this bill, leave the sunset in place, that somehow these good folks can continue to operate. And that's just not true. I'm not familiar with the Chapter 10 permitting process that was mentioned earlier, but I can tell you that this statute at 23-5111 requires that these licensees be certified annually. The sunset language in subsection J says all certifications expire on December 31st, 2022. So it's not a matter of just, oh, you can't go collect eggs. If you are in possession of those birds on that day, that triggers in the regulations of Chapter 60, Section 16, a 60-day window to dispose of all those birds. And at that time, the birds become the ownership of the game and fish. So I just wanted to clear that up. Had several questions to that point. The certification itself expires at the end of this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Committee questions for either Mr. True, Mr. Braybeck, or Mr. Smith? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So, Mr. Smith, if we extended the sunset date, does that possibly help? I would hate to see the birds destroyed, and that appears to be the only alternative. Is
Mr. Smith.
Madam Chair, Representative Sweeney, I'm not going to say that's the only alternative. Practicality will, I'm sure, the director and his people will work and decide what dispose means and how that would happen. My only point is that if the sunset it stays in place with the current date that as of December 31st of this year, the licensee, the permittee will no longer be certified. And in order to possess these birds, you have to be certified. So how that gets worked out with those entities, I don't want to presume.
Committee, yes, Representative Knapp and then Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The question is the focus of the research now. Is it more focused on the breeding of those 51 birds, or will there still be some anticipated collection?
Mr. Brayback?
Madam Chairman,
True.
I guess I could answer that.
Okay.
We would prefer not to gather any additional eggs. We are hopeful that the birds will breed in captivity, and those will be our source of eggs. There is a possibility, and the reason we'd like to continue to have that authorization in the statute is if we need genetic diversity, then we would have to go out and gather additional eggs because we couldn't do it within the bird farm. And the Game and Fish tells us where we can gather the eggs. It's not unilateral on our part. So if that came about, that would be the one circumstance where but it's very expensive to gather the eggs, and we would prefer not to.
Representative Banks.
Madam Chair, thank you. That was one of my questions. Is the ultimate goal to promulgate enough that you could release those into the wild at some point? That's one question. And then could you tell me a little bit about the facility? Is it like a certified research facility? Is it a game farm? Where does that fall? Thank you.
Mr. Brayback?
What we have is a game bird farm that is certified by the Game and Fish Commission. And it is a facility that has flight pens, breeding facility or hatching facilities, incubation facilities, and a brooder facilities. So we have this large facility that we have the birds in, but whether or not we can get to the point where we can release them in the wild, we don't know that yet. There's a lot of research that we have to do before we can get to that point.
Vice Chairman Newsom.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. What other birds do you raise? I'm assuming that sage grouse are not the only bird you raise. And what success rate have you had with those other species of birds if you are releasing them or hatching them or that sort of
Mr.
thing?
Brayback?
Madam Chairman, we raise pheasants, chuckers, Hungarian partridge. Most of these birds are sold for hunting birds, sport shooting, and like that. However, the only reference point that I really have is what success do we have is on my own place out of Grable, where either I'm a lousy shot or whatever, but I went from no pheasants at all to where I've got a nice brood of pheasants up around my silage pits and in our habitat away from where our hunting preserve is. So that I know it's anecdotal, but we do have personal experiences. We do have some success when they are released.
Follow up.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So for those species, do you collect eggs and hatch them, or do you have breeding animals on the preserve, or how does that work?
Madam Chairman, yes, the answer to that is yes. We purchase eggs, we purchase chicks, we have our own hens that we raise our own eggs in all species.
Mr. Brayback, there's been questions about withholding data and proprietary data. Could you please speak to that?
Madam Chairman, our purpose is to try to raise the birds. We have invited the University of Wyoming, actually Northwest College, to participate in our endeavors. And we have not withheld any data. The application explains that we file with the Game and Fish Commission, goes through how we do everything, how everything is accomplished, and sometimes we'll even go back to refer to what we did the previous year.
Thank you. Committee, further questions? Yes, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You mentioned a private success story, the Peregrine Falcon, and I'm curious what type of permitting, if you're aware how that was allowed to proceed, and if you see any Title 10 special permitting opportunity to continue even if this sunset.
Madam Chairman, I have to admit, I don't know the answer to that question. I know there was a private foundation that was created. I don't know if there was any permitting required. I simply don't know. Sorry.
I have another question, and this is probably tacky, but can you convey your cost to date?
Yes, I can. We have spent approximately $500,000 of the foundation money and about $50,000 of mine.
Thank you, sir. Committee, further questions? Yes, Representative Haroldson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you guys for coming here today. And obviously, majority of us weren't here in 2017 when this original bill came forward. And so in some ways, we're inheriting a beautiful situation here where we get two very, very polarizing sides. And I see both sides. It was something was said, you wouldn't raise these for money. It isn't something where you'd go after this for the financial purpose. And so I think here more what I'm hearing isn't probably even so much the situation where I think the sunset date might be a smaller issue as we've got 51 birds we're dealing with. And these 51 birds need to be addressed. Those birds are not within that short window where they could be put with a mom. These birds, I mean, and no one get offended when I say this, they're dumb birds now. They've been in captivity. You put those into the wild, they will be dead birds. They will be dead by predators. They'll be dead by anything that flies or walks, and they're going to die. And so I think we're at a point right now where the decision that needs to be made is how do we protect these 51 birds and the potential of a program that could find out some really good things about it and work with it. But I've also heard there's 4 potential licenses out there. That's what concerns me is what else could we do in the long run here if we extend this sunset date? So I think maybe the bigger question is how do we give you guys freedom, but at the same time protect this from growing into a bigger issue? And I know I'm way spitballing here and I'm going on a limb, but I think that's almost more the issue. I've got the original House Bill 271 that was 2017 legislation that is now obviously an enrolled Act 91. I think that almost maybe needs to be more the conversation is how do we protect these 51 birds, allowing you guys to move forward with Game and Fish and everyone being a part of, but at the same time, maybe not opening this up to be a bigger issue down the road that we're going to have to deal with. So maybe less of a question, more of a statement, but I think that's kind of where we're at. And let me get your guys' feedback on that. If we were to look at putting sideboards on to limit this from moving forward into a bigger issue, giving you guys that freedom to continue on the process, you've obviously put the money and time and energy in because you legally were given that ability. What would that look like, and would that be something that could potentially work?
Madam Chair, Representative Haroldson, just briefly before Mr. True probably has a response, but just on I just want to point out the limit to 5 licensees or permits. That's in the Game and Fish regulations. The statute itself was silent on that point. And so I wanted to make that point. I also wanted to make the point, just for reference, I assume the Game and Fish limited that number to a manageable number and one that would have no impact on the broader population. And if we heard millions of birds or hundreds of thousands of birds in Wyoming, and the current statute and regs limit the collection to 250 eggs per permit, I think you can see this isn't the collection itself isn't going to have that impact.
Mr. True.
Madam Chair, we really need
to have the sunset extended one way or another, so we can continue our own work. It's a policy decision for you all as to whether or not you want to limit the number of applicants. That was in the regs, which I frankly thought it was in the statutes, but thank you. And so maybe you could ask the Game and Fish to revisit that. But we find ourselves in the situation to where we can't move forward if this bill is killed.
Thank you all. I appreciate you coming down. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your work. I'd like to hear from someone else who's in favor of the bill. Mr. McGagna. While he's coming forward, I think that to answer your question, Representative Haroldson, I don't think that would work for this bill. It doesn't fit within the definition of the bill. It would have to come next year. Mr. McGagna, Wyoming Stock Growers Association, Wyoming Wool Growers, who are you with today?
I'm with both today, Madam Chair,
Okay.
and happy to be here. And I'll be extremely brief. I think you've heard some good testimony today. A couple of things. Those of us in the ranching industry and agriculture in general, frankly, live in fear every day of a potential listing of the sage grouse and what the implications of that could be for the continued viability of our operations. And not only that, but many in our industry have really stepped forward to work with the state on sage grouse management in an effort to defer or minimize the possibility of a listing, but it still continues to be out there for us. And while we certainly support good science, I think that's an important managing a species like this. I would also emphasize the ingenuity of the private sector, which can come to play when addressing a challenging issue like this. I can't sit here today and say that we have confidence that the work that's being done by the current party is going to provide the answer. But if it can provide some part of the answer that at some future date precludes a listing of this bird, it's very well justified. And this is not a species that I foresee is going to recover and like the wolf, that in another 5 years or 10 years, we can say, okay, we don't need to worry about sage grouse anymore. It's very likely that the potential for the species to be at risk and be listed may continue for many years into the future. So I think that we can't afford not to take advantage of every one of these opportunities. With regards to the any future efforts like this, our emphasis would be on keeping the current project operating because they've committed resources, they've taken more time than they had hoped to take, and see where this can go in next stages. Will it or will it not lead to the ability to release birds successfully out? We don't know the answers to that yet, and it would be most unfortunate for us to stop a project like this at this point without obtaining those answers. So whatever the commission may decide in the Game and Fish with regards to whether to authorize more of these or not to authorize them, I think what's important today is to remove this language, which as we read it, if it were to remain in place, would cancel the certification that the current operator has and require the Game and Fish to make some arrangements to dispose of those birds. I think that would be most unfortunate. But in terms of how much more of this we need, if we need any more than this one, we tend to favor leaving that in the jurisdiction of the Game and Fish Commission, who can make those calls on a more regular basis than having to come back to the legislature for those calls. So with that, simply would encourage you to move this bill forward as it's currently drafted. Be happy to take any questions.
Questions for Mr. McGagna? Thank you, sir. Appreciate your testimony. Who else is in favor of the bill? Mr. Obermuller.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman. Pete Obermuller with the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. It's very much a pleasure to be here. I never, ever get a chance to hang out with the cool kids on this committee. So I'm excited.
Come more often.
Madam Chairman, interesting discussion. I know it's dragging on. We're in support of the bill, Madam Chairman, and I just want to ask the committee to take a pretty giant step back on it. So we've gone now 5 consecutive quarters without oil and gas lease sale from the federal government, with significant cost to the state of Wyoming. The lease sale that the federal government was supposed to have in Q1 by court order and by rule of law that they still haven't done was initially 459 parcels. But 264 of those, I'm sorry, Madam Chairman, 264 of those parcels were deferred primarily because they are in sage grouse priority area, overlapping core area, the areas where we as a state have done precisely what other folks who have testified have talked about, have worked diligently and in cooperation on habitat protection. And yet, the federal government defers them without explanation of why the executive order and the habitat protection that we've done has not been sufficient. I would argue, Madam Chairman, that we were likely to see petitions to have the sage grouse relisted. There's not very much that makes me lose sleep about the ability of my members to operate, but that is one. And so, Madam Chairman, what's most important to me today for my members is that in some form, this certification is extended for this organization so that they can continue their work. It's not about having every tool. It's about evaluating tools that can work. And it's premature after 5 years to say, never going to work, can't do it. That's what we said 5 years ago, and look at the success that they've had so far. I think they need the opportunity to have a little bit more time. And I think, Madam Chairman, you know that it's important to me to try to find ways to say yes to things. I think there are ways that this could be moved forward where the organization could move forward and still protect some of the concerns with respect to timing, et cetera. Madam Chairman, I would just add one last thought. It's striking to me to hear the concern about private involvement in conservation. I would contend, Madam Chairman, that train has left the station so many decades ago that you cannot even see it. There is no way to effectively manage and conserve wildlife in Wyoming without private involvement. You heard about the numbers from the organization, but there's millions and millions that individuals and my members and Mr. McGagna's members and others have spent on sage grouse conservation and other wildlife conservation in partnership with the state of Wyoming, Game and Fish and others. It is a public-private partnership. That's how we succeed in Wyoming. So to simply say that it's unprecedented and we can't possibly move forward, I think it just defies reality. We need to have private sector at the table to make this work, Madam Chairman. So I would ask that you move the bill forward and continue to discuss ways to make it palatable. Appreciate your time, Madam Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Obermueller. Committee questions? Thank you. Appreciate your time. Anyone else in support of? Well, yes, come forward, Mr. Luthi. We are going to carry it over, but we don't mind hearing from you. I have 3 people online. Clarissa, are they still with us?
Madam Chair, they are.
Okay. And the reason that I'm pressed for time, it's now 10 minutes till, and we have a hard stop in about 5 minutes. So I apologize. I should have, when you came in the room, I should have spoken to you, but please share your thoughts.
Madam Chairman, Randall Luthi, Energy and Game and Fish Advisor for the Governor Gordon. I will not take 5 minutes. The governor is generally supportive of this bill. Frankly, we see it in the governor's office as this is a job half done. There is a chance to get more science, more facts, more of what we learn, what might be possible. And so we would be supportive of extending the sunset date of the bill. Finally, there's been a lot of talk about and speculation about habitat versus rearing. Frankly, we probably are going to need both. Right now, I think the science is pretty clear. Habitat is key.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we don't know enough about rearing to know if that's going to make a difference or not. So with that, Madam Chairman, that may be the shortest testimony you've ever received from me.
Committee questions for the former Speaker of the House? Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. We do have time for if the people online, why don't you bring all 3 of them in and we'll just, as long as they know that we're really pressed for time.
Madam Chair, we also have, I believe, Allison Holloran calling in. And
Okay,
then we
let's hold
also
off
have-
on her. Let's just stick with our virtual, and then if Ms. Holleran could join us again on Thursday.
And then Madam Chair, we also have Mark Boyce.
Pardon me?
We also have Mark Boyce online as well.
Okay. And who do we have here? Is this Mr. Bear?
Madam Chair, that's Mr. Boyce and Mr. Bear as well.
Okay. Mr. Bear, if you'd please go first, and if you could please limit your comments to 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Committee, my name is Carl Bear. I work as the manager for Diamond Wings. I also oversee the management of the Sage Grouse facility. And I had the opportunity to attend a legislative session in 2017 when it was just a theory or a thought and dream. And today I'm here in Powell with the 51 healthy birds. And it is quite an honor. And I have been working with them from the time in the field when we collected the eggs and brought them home and incubated. There were 17 nests, and we incubated and hatched each nest separately and then brooded them separately. So it was quite a process and a lot of transitions. We lost some birds, but we learned a lot. I've also had the opportunity to go to Calgary and meet with the Calgary Zoo staff, as well as the Sutton Research Center. They've all been very good in sharing their dialogue with me and ideas. I must say, I don't have a background in biology. I have a bachelor's degree, but I've raised birds for 25 years, a variety of quail, partridges, and pheasants. And it's taken a lot, but hopefully I've transferred a lot of my skills and things that I've learned with those other birds to raising the sage grouse, and it worked. That's the neat thing. It's worked. Like I said, it was a dream before, and now it's worked, and we have the birds here. Our next step is really, in my mind, is working at breeding them. We have the, our people at the Calgary Zoo willing to help in any way they can, and they have. And I think we'll be successful again with their support. But that's my personal goal, is to breed those birds and then hatch those eggs and then rear those eggs and see how we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Who's next? I'm sorry, Clarissa.
Madam Chair, we have Mark Boyce online, and then we also have Gwen McKee.
Mr. Boyce, we won't have time for McKee.
Madam Chair, my name is Mark Boyce. I have been working on sage grouse for 45 years. I began working on sage grouse in 1977 at the invitation of Harry Haryu of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I was at the University of Wyoming as a professor until 1993. I'm now at the University of Alberta, where we also have sage grouse and have conducted sage grouse research. I've raised about 700, a little over 700 sage grouse in captivity. We have one of the, I think maybe the only publication, peer-reviewed publication on rearing sage grouse. It's in the Wildlife Society Bulletin in 1991. My research has been cited 36,000 times. I have a PhD from Yale University, and I was a native postdoc at Oxford. So I have a lot of background working with sage grouse, and we've had some serious issues with sage grouse, including disease. West Nile caused major die-offs in the state of Wyoming back in the 90s. Our efforts to rear sage grouse were highly successful in that we could hatch them and raise them, but getting them to survive in the wild, as has been mentioned several times during this testimony, has been almost, well, there's been zero success. And likewise, getting them to breed in captivity has been a major hurdle. We struggled with nutrition issues. Every weekend for 3 years, I was out cutting sagebrush by hand and bringing it into our birds to feed them, presuming that nutrition issues were part of the problem we were having with captive rearing. again, raising them to adult size and getting them to survive for 2 and 3 years was not so much of a problem, but that was in captivity, and getting them to survive in the wild has not been successful. In fact, translocation experiments on sage grouse have not been successful. Our sage grouse in Alberta are desperately endangered. We have about 43 males, I believe, at the moment, and about an equal number of females, and they're very likely to go extinct based upon the trajectories of change that we've seen in the past. I might just mention a few other things about disease. Much of my research on sage grouse when I was at the University of Wyoming was on disease-related matters and the importance of disease in reproduction. Many of the birds, I think 43% of the birds that we worked with north of Laramie had avian malaria. Prior to our study, there were some die-offs caused by coccidiosis, which is probably one of the main drivers for cyclic oscillations in sage grouse populations. Lice are a major infestation in wild sage grouse in the Laramie area. As I mentioned before, West Nile virus has caused major die-offs in Wyoming and in Alberta and in Montana.
Dr. Boyce, if I might stop you there, I apologize for interrupting. It's just that we are really pressed for time. So we will, and I want to apologize to everybody in the room. I had no idea there would be so much testimony. I had not been given a heads up on this at all. Otherwise, I would have been a little bit better at my timing and my scheduling. But I appreciate everybody's patience and understanding, you as well, Dr. Boyce. And we will carry this over into our meeting on Thursday. Committee, are you all in favor of that? All right. So we thank you all for your time, and we'll continue this discussion on Thursday. Thank you.